I draw a lot of the inspirations whenever I travel to, not only seeing the new buildings, but also see the historic places. I think those are really the places where, on the one hand, you see, the lessons learned from history, lessons learned from human activity and use over the centuries, but also you can start to see really how we can learn a lot from these projects or these buildings in terms of sustainability.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today, I was speaking with Rutger Huiberts, architect, design director at KPF. Rutger, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jose. Thanks for the invite.
Let's dive in. So talk to me about your upbringing. You have over a decade of experience across architecture and urban planning. Before you're doing what you're doing, what were some of the major influences in your life?
Yeah, so I can take you through some of the main chapters of my career so far. So starting from the outskirts of Amsterdam, where I grew up. As a teenager, I always felt this kind of urge to, go out there and explore the world. And so very soon after I finished high school, I ended up moving to Italy. I learned the language. I moved to Florence, Italy. And then I enrolled in university there, completed a bachelor's degree in urban and environmental planning. And so, in the end, I learned a lot from living in that city. It's a very ancient city. It's built several centuries ago. There's a very strong culture of preserving the urban and ecological environment. And so I learned the value of that, the value of beauty and art and preservation of something that can be really good for a city's pride and the city's environment. At the same time, after 5 years, I realized that I was craving for something a little bit more dynamic and places that were offering a little bit more dynamic economical environment for my career. So I ended up moving back to the Netherlands, enrolling in another bachelor's degree in architecture, and then did a master's degree as well at Delft University of Technology. And so for me, that was a really fantastic learning environment because it's a school that allows you to really develop your own path. It offers a lot of diversity in terms of its programs. There's a strong focus on building technology, urban and infrastructure planning, but it also really teaches the student to focus on the artistic and creative sides of things. And so I really learned there how to become an architect that responds in the work directly to human needs and human uses of space. In a way, that's where I started to explore my early interest in parametric design and sort of how technology and design tools that we use as architects can actually help us make buildings that are smarter, but also how we can use them in a more artistic way. And so I graduated at the height of the financial and euro crisis. And so when I came out of school, I wasn't really expecting to find a good job, but I ended up finding quite an exciting place to work in the Netherlands as well, at one of the most sort of exciting architecture firms called MVRDV over there. So I ended up doing a lot of conceptual work, very strong focus on design, developed a lot of new ideas of mixed-use projects, projects all around the world, very sort of iconic pieces of architecture. And so after a few years of learning the ropes there, I also realized that very few of our projects were getting built. And so I started to miss that connection with the construction industry and missing this potential of realizing your projects and getting them seen in construction. And so that was one of the reasons why I joined the firm that I currently work for, which is called KPF, Cohn Pedersen Fox.
So I've been with the firm for a little over 11 years now, and I work as a design lead on a variety of commercial, residential, mixed-use projects, as well as projects of master planning in the different parts of the world. As a firm, we're very much committed to designing net zero carbon buildings by the year 2030. And together with our team, we're working towards making that possible. And so as architects, I believe we are in a very unique position within the design process. In the way we integrate and combine all the work of the different disciplines. We're expected to be experts in very different fields, and also the way we mediate between the interests of different stakeholders is really central to the role of the architect. And as such, I think that there's a lot of potential when it comes to architects taking the lead in the effort of managing the complexities of the design process and managing the data and analytics that go into it. And all of that in order to make our design process smarter, our designs less wasteful, and our information more manageable.
One of the things that stands out is I think you've talked about the importance of kind of like a city on a human scale, or even design kind of with humans at the center. What does that mean? Like conceptually and as well as practically, how do you think about that in when you approach the design of a building or even a master plan? Diving into maybe some of the kind of philosophy and just kind of like what's influencing you. Yeah.
I think in the end, the inspirations that I use for my designs really can come from so many different angles. It can come from art. It can come from buildings or places that I visit. And I think as a designer, it's always really important to keep looking around you and experience new places, new things. And so I draw a lot of the inspirations whenever I travel to, not only seeing the new buildings, but also see the historic places. I think those are really the places where, on the one hand, you see, the lessons learned from history, lessons learned from human activity and use over the centuries, but also you can start to see really how we can learn a lot from these projects or these buildings in terms of sustainability. So the way they're crafted, the way they deal with climate challenges, the way they deal with creating buildings that are usable over time. And so in a way, we can learn so much from these historic places. In terms of architecture, I really was inspired by some of the Dutch architects, sort of the grand names of the humanist architecture traditions of the 50s and 60s, where they always looked at sort of the modularity of space and how people were using these kinds of spaces in the most sort of creative ways. And also during my studies, I got really fascinated by the metabolist movement in Japan. This is a movement that really had a very strong focus on the meaning of technology and how that technology was changing the way people build and use their cities. And so they were envisioning these cities that were basically constantly adapted and constantly reused, and sort of constant mobility and constant type of evolution. And so for me, that's still a way of looking at buildings as pieces of, built environment that are never finished, but can always be adjusted or readapted or reused. And therefore, you should always design them in such a way that there is some form of flexibility to be adjusted later on.
I'm curious just to understand even further. That's an interesting thing you mentioned there about some of the kind of Japanese inspiration. Are there specific like kind of components or materials or the way that they approach space making that kind of draws you into that kind of human-centric approach?
Yeah, I think there's always an incredible attention to the places people touch. As an architect, you're always kind of involved in creating spaces that people are inhabiting, but they're also touching and using them. And so you can see different uses of materials. And I always feel that that's a really fascinating part of our profession, to make spaces that can not just be visually appreciated, but also touched and felt.
Yeah, that's super interesting. How then do you translate some of the things that have influenced you into your day-to-day? So, I imagine from what we're doing now with the virtual call to a design meeting to a client meeting to meeting with your team, how do you kind of begin to translate this at a practical level across a typical Tuesday for you?
Yeah, I don't really have typical days, which is, in part a curse, part a blessing. I really enjoy actually the variety of the things I do. And so the firm I work for, we operate really on a global scale. So my projects are not really bound by any region or typology. I have projects in New York City, as well as, regularly projects in Europe, the Middle East, and consistently projects in Asia. So one of my main focuses is on projects in Asia. And so we work with teams across the globe. So in a way, on a daily basis, I interact with people across different time zones. Our clients are also in different time zones. And so you can't really have a very fixed pattern in this way. You always need to connect to the right person at the right time. And so you can't really expect to have a regular day in the office. What I do also really enjoy about the work is going on site. So that's one of the things that I do on a regular basis, either through traveling to our sites in Asia or closer to home, visiting our sites in New York. So that connection with the construction industry is something I really enjoy.
Right.
And then working with the teams globally is really quite interesting. We usually check in the morning or in the evening, depending on the time zone. The afternoons, I usually keep a little bit more free so that I have time to actually work and focus on my own tasks. I also am involved in some of the technology efforts in our firm. So I am part of the visualization leadership group, as well as the BIM leadership group within our firm. And so what I do is with the tech specialists that we have in-house, it's one of the benefits of working in large firms that we have these bigger tech teams within our pool of colleagues. I work with them to understand really what are the newest developments and also how we can sort of make the connection between our studios, the junior staff. I'm sort of the intermediate between those tech experts and what our staff do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to close the gap between what is our best practice and what is available in terms of software development and technology.
Have you found when you're working across time zones and across different stakeholders and with different team members, are there other strategies or technology that you employ that you found is particularly successful in trying to, I guess, guide everybody towards a particular mission? I'm curious on a day-to-day, what tools or strategies have you found as effective?
So interestingly, I feel that COVID, as much as COVID was disrupting the way we were working, we were no longer in the shared office space. We're no longer able to travel to our teams across the planet, with the travel bans in place and no longer being in the same space in the office. It is easy to imagine that would be very challenging for us to work, but I noticed that we were actually able to quite seamlessly transition into this work from home mode. And also because we have the teams on the site in Asia and in other parts of the world, we were able to also continue our work fairly much without being affected much. What I do feel is very important is face-to-face contact, because ultimately you don't really build a team if you're just working remotely. You never get to spend some time in the same place and really build a rapport, build trust. I think being in the same space is very important. I also feel that for keeping the consistency of a design and keeping the continuity of a design process, it's really important that you keep people involved from start to finish. You keep them sort of engaged within the process and not just people being part of it and then handing it over to someone else. I think in order to get a very consistent design process across, you need to know each other, you need to know each other's preferences, and you need to also know the prehistory of a project as it evolves. And so I think that's a really important key to helping continuity within the team, creating synergy within the team, is that you know each other, you spend time together, and you actually stay consistently involved in the project so that people can take ownership.
That's really exciting. And you mentioned something that I wanted to maybe spend some time on. So not only are you spending across different team members, different stakeholders, but across different continents. In particular, some of your work in Asia is something that I think in many ways something we can learn from. What have you found, if at all, are some of the perspectives or differences building and designing in Asia versus, say, in the United States?
What you see is that there are some aesthetic sensibilities or trends that are different for each geography. And so when it comes to forms or material finishes, different colors, or the relation a building has to its surrounding landscape, each geography has its own preferences when it comes to that. But from a design perspective, what I think is very interesting is that each context, or even more specifically, each client we work with or each commission we are given, is ultimately a unique one. And so just like each site is a unique place, what you'll see is that for each of the projects that we complete, the outcome is very unique. And that's something I think that architecture should always strive for, to create a unique answer to each specific brief.
I think whatever context you deal with, the architectural profession is effectively remarkably globalized. So do very similar work in different places around the world. What changes a lot is, the regulations, the framework in which you set up a consultants team. All of those things, they change, but the general activity as an architect is very similar. We also, we're hired on a global level because we bring that sort of consistent way of working across the world. What does differ, of course, are sort of local environments and local regulations. And so one of the key challenges there is really to work with your team to understand what are those regulations, because you can never know, every regulation. You cannot understand every context to its full degree. Right. So that's also the importance of having local experts. And the way we work together with them is really understanding within which framework you operate and then try to design to the smartest way.
Yeah. I'm curious, is there a project that might stand out that you recently completed, whether in the States or Asia, that was an example of success in your philosophy?
So as a firm, we're currently really pushing the capabilities of how we integrate data-driven design as well as sustainability into our everyday design practice. And for that reason, I'm particularly excited about the ComCenter project that I'm working on in Singapore. The project in many ways really sets an example of where we're headed in terms of the design workflows, and also how we leverage the more data-driven and knowledge-based workflows and align those with our architectural design philosophy. And so for the ComCenter redevelopment project, on the one hand, we're dealing with a very large and complex project in a very dense part of Singapore. If you combine that with a client and developer who have really set their goals for this project to achieve some of the most ambitious targets in terms of sustainability and also operationally for their organizations, we really saw that this project from the start was a big opportunity for us to push for better integration of our technical and analytical tools within the design process. And so what we're doing here is really use these tools at very frequent intervals to test the design that that we're developing, and making sure that we really have a most informed process that is achievable. The project is a little over 1 million square feet of program in total. About 3/4 of that is office space, and for that office space, we decided to really push the boundary of what is the most efficient and the most high-tech approach that you can achieve. That means that we've designed all the facades and all the spaces to really be super high performance. We have very carefully calibrated all the shading devices in the facades, making sure that the glazed areas are performing, maximizing daylighting, minimizing solar gain, avoiding the peak radiation, and all of that allowed us to have a super low energy mechanical system, and as a result, a super low energy building. The remainder of the program is a really interesting mix of retail, amenities, gym, healthcare. There's a wellness program, educational facilities, large auditorium. And this is a trend that we see in many of our projects. There's a lot of amenities going into these kinds of large-scale commercial developments. And because of the regulation in Singapore, we also had to integrate a very vast amount of green space into the project. And so these green spaces are sprinkled throughout the building form. There's roof gardens, sky garden terraces, there's vertical greenery, there's a vast rooftop park, and all of those green spaces are publicly accessible. And so what we wanted to do, especially for the program in the podium, is to make sure that this kind of vibrant program is very well connected to the surrounding city, but also to all those green spaces within the podium. And so what we did there was to actually follow a super low-tech approach. So the towers are very high-tech, the podium is very low-tech. And for that low-tech podium, we really draw the inspiration from the way people in Singapore have traditionally dealt with their very hot and humid climate. And so we very much rely on the principles of passive design for the podium spaces. All the circulation places are located outdoors. We are recessing all the facades so that we minimize solar gain, and we provide a lot of outdoor areas that are sheltered from the rain and shaded from the sun. And by doing so, we also reduce all the cooling loads. And so we very much rely on outdoor, naturally ventilated spaces to the highest degree possible. And as a result, we create a building that's very smart, very responsive to the environment, and as a result, also very sustainable. In order to back up these assumptions for this kind of low-tech portion of the project, we had to rely on a lot more analytical tools. And so for that reason, we really had to fine-tune all our in-house capabilities of simulating and analyzing the design. And so we do very regular check-ins on the design when it comes to daylight access, natural ventilation, solar gain, passive cooling, thermal comfort. And so all of these things together make for a very smart set of tools that allow us to continuously monitor the design process. And in the end, these tools have really become integral part of the design process. They allow us to communicate with our client, and we constantly test and fine-tune the design to see if we're moving in the right direction. And so rather than solely relying on an external consultant to run the analyses at the end of the design process or at the different milestones, we actually constantly monitor the design as it is developed.
Yeah. You mentioned, quite a bit there. Are there, based off your experience, is there emerging trends that you're paying attention to that seem to be kind of a recurring thread in your work, whether that's cultural or the way that we should be viewing technology, or even, some of the kind of local considerations? What are some of the emerging trends that you're paying attention to and looking to employ in some of your projects?
Yeah, we see a much stricter emphasis on the accounting that goes into the design process. So, whereas a few years ago, you could design something that was fairly, schematic, you didn't have to prove too many things. Right now, we need to rely on a lot more analytical tools, provide the data, analyze our designs so that we can really prove their performance, and also go through different options and iterations that really help us fine-tune these performances. And so compared to, 10, 15 years ago, the process is much more data-driven, much more knowledge-driven. And so a design is much more compelling and also much more tested if the data is lacking. And so for that reason, I really see that that's a very strong trend. We also put a lot of focus within our firm to understand our designs and how we can very easily analyze them and create all the data that's necessary to back up, what kind of design decisions we made.
Is there an example, like when you double click onto the data component, are we talking building data, contextual data? How are you kind of putting these different components together?
Yeah, at the moment we are really making big efforts in terms of embodied carbon, also because we see that some of the regulations in different places around the world are getting really focused on embodied carbon, operational carbon as well. Yeah. But in terms of our construction process, we really need to understand very early on in the design process what are the implications on embodied carbon of the choice of one system versus another, the choice of one facade material to another. And so embodied carbon is one of them. The other part that we really do much more consistently now is, whereas previously we would come up with a design, at the very end of the design stage, we would get a LEED certification or we get some form of environmental analysis run. What we do now is much earlier in the process, start these environmental analyses. And so what we focus on a lot is thermal comfort levels, daylighting analysis, facade performance, and so facade shading, solar gain analyses. And these are really done very, very often within the design process, so that every step of the way you can make a choice that is actually down the line, avoiding you to go back to the drawing table when you don't meet the targeted requirement.
Right. Super interesting. I mean, this is so necessary. I think one of the points that you mentioned is so key, even when you compare the design process, 10 years ago, where I'm a big believer that in order for us as architects or as builders or folks in real estate to be able to proactively determine what we should do with our buildings, we need to kind of understand what is, right? And what actually exists. And so to your point, I couldn't agree more. I think the importance of just understanding what exists to then make kind of informed decisions on what should be. I guess maybe to shift gears a little bit. So you talked about, in your early career, moving around different places and how you ended up here in New York. But, if you had to talk to your kind of younger self as an aspiring architect, are there things that you've learned from your experience in the last 10 years that you would go back, to 20-year-old version of yourself and tell you like, hey, here's what you should probably know before you get into the architectural field? I'm curious, what are things that stand out to you?
Well, one of the things you learn over the years is that these projects that we do, especially the ones that we do at our firm, very large scale ones, very complex projects, a lot of very large consultants teams are involved, and also very complex decision-taking processes, of course, is really that you need to be robust and flexible enough to adapt to change. And so you need to be flexible enough to adapt to change so that you can actually make your design better, go back to the drawing table when needed, not be too hung up on, your design intent, but actually be flexible. What I've learned a lot is that you can learn from all the consultants and experts on the team. And so you need to listen and in a way, become the intermediary between all the different stakeholders that are at the table.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as you kind of look back, the importance of, I disregarded the importance of communication, right? And to your point, there's kind of a vision we have as designers, but then just kind of being kind of almost adaptable as you learn new things from different stakeholders, the community.
As a designer, you're not just the only originator of the design. Actually, you work with an entire team of other designers. I also work with the partners who are designing as well, and so I work with an entire team of designers to carry out these projects. And we're really the ones facilitating the dialogue between all sorts of different experts, local stakeholders, politicians. There's also a lot of politics involved in these processes, especially when there are projects that impact larger portions of the urban environment. And very often all these interests and stakes are contradictory. And so as designers, we are really the intermediaries who are responsible for making sure everyone communicates, making sure that everything is translated in a coherent and convincing story. So compelling design shouldn't only be just beautiful, but it should also be able to explain how it mediates between all the different stakeholders and how it solves the different problems that it's tasked to resolve. Looking ahead, how do you envision the evolution of these buildings and kind of urban spaces in the next few years, whether 3, 5, 10 years? What does it look like? Yeah, it's interesting to see because there are very many changes happening at the moment that no one hasn't quite figured out yet where things are heading. There's, of course, some trouble in the commercial office market that we don't quite know yet where things are heading. But there are very strong trends that we can see happening. One of the ways of looking at this is that there's a very strong shift in terms of what is being developed and what sort of projects are happening where. Mm-hmm. And what really drives, I think, what is sort of an overarching trend that we see here is that there's a desire for proximity between office buildings and residential is a very strong one. And so you see that some of the more successful places in the world are really the places where residential and office are very closely in close proximity to each other. And so in a way, what we see is that the areas that are struggling most, where the development's really lagging behind, are those sort of monofunctional CBDs. And so the main downtowns of this urban areas that are really office market only or office product only are really the ones that are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it's really an effect of COVID as well, with these sort of lower occupancies that we see now, is that these areas really feel like wastelands. They feel like places where no one really works or no one really lives. And so no one really wants to work in what looks like a deserted wasteland for most of the week. And so what you see in a place like Singapore is interesting. They actively stimulate the development of residential within the monofunctional office CBD. And so you see a lot of hospitality projects there, residential projects that really try to bring a much more mixed use environment about in these more office-oriented areas. But they also, at the same time, stimulate office development and commercial and entertainment developments in their more residential neighborhoods. And that sort of brings this proximity about that you really want to have, is that where people work, they can actually find entertainment, they can find retail within a 5-minute walk, but it's also not too far away from their residences. And similarly, no one wants to work in a deserted office environment because there's no activity going on.
Yeah.
We also see this happen in the kind of more unexpected areas. You see the first office tower happen in downtown Brooklyn, which was predominantly residential to fairly recently. Or we start to see a lot of our projects happening in the outskirts, in the suburbs, where we are developing sort of medium density mixed use projects, where we are bringing into what previously were just vast residential areas. We're bringing mixed use entertainment and commercial property into those areas. And so this mixing up and making a sort of a much more varied urban environment is really what we see as a big trend. And ultimately, this leads to a much more livable and walkable city. It's much more transit oriented, so people really reduce their time commuting. In a way, that's really a direct effect of all the desires that we've seen, arise during COVID, in which people were very happy to work from home, but at the same time, we're missing those more vibrant urban environments that they were cut off from.
A second trend that we see emerge is a really substantial increase in the number of projects that deal with the repositioning of office buildings or the adaptive reuse of existing structures in general. It's a big trend that we see happen worldwide. When we look at a few examples that our firm has recently completed in New York City, such as 660 Fifth Avenue or Hudson Commons, 390 Madison, or the One Madison project that's scheduled to be completed this summer, you'll see that for each of these projects, the design team had to find a very unique strategy to address the problems of each unique site. Some of these sites are underbuilt, some sites are overbuilt, some sites are dealing simply with a subpar quality of the spaces. And so for each of these projects, the design team also really pushes to find ways to creatively leverage what is the existing quality of a pre-existing structure. And so there's something really magical that happens when you take an underused structure and give it a new life, you update it to a new purpose. And each of these projects really demonstrates how the outcome of a design process can also really lead to an architecture that is very unique, also very sustainable because of the reuse of the embodied carbon of the existing structure. And also in each of these cases, these projects have been extremely successful commercially. What I also personally find very interesting about this approach is that you can see in the architecture that is the result of this process, how the history or the evolution of a city is visible and is exposed in its architecture. And so the character of a place becomes much richer and more layered and ultimately much more identifiable to the inhabitants.
Yeah. I think your perspective as to what the future of cities looks like that's livable, that to your point, has a close proximity as to the way that we work and live. I'm fascinated, and I'm excited to see how your work and your team's work, continues to evolve in the next few years, especially in such a critical time where, the way that we see offices and homes is kind of vastly changing. So when I hear kind of generative and the approach there, actually with AI and how we're all kind of reshaping our own workflows and how do we understand what adds value versus what makes noise, what do you see as kind of the more effective uses as to generative work and what that might mean for design or construction?
I think it's interesting. AI is kind of revolutioning the architect's profession at the moment. It's the speed at which these new technologies are becoming available is quite mind-blowing. But at the same time, it's still very much in its infancy because it's only really quite strongly focused on visual generative AI for visualization purposes. Mm-hmm. So our firm is really using a lot of that. But at the same time, you can start to see, the first signs of how AI is also infiltrating other parts of our process. You can start to see how it becomes quite powerful in the way we can automate repetitive work, how we can automate clash detection and quality control. Ultimately, that will, takes hopefully similar kinds of needs that we start to see that it will revolutionize these other aspects of the way we design and document buildings. Ultimately, what will help us do is really be much more understanding of the accounting that goes into this process. So in a way, we built these models that are highly digital, but they also incorporate a lot of data parameters that we can use to draw from. It will eventually lead is a much more accurate accounting of the systems we choose, the way they perform, the way we can actually replace them or alternate solutions for their usage. And so ultimately, where that will lead to is buildings that are really highly equipped to be mined for data. At the same time, it also allows us to understand much more what will happen with them in their afterlife. So what happens to the construction waste? What happens to once a building needs to be readapted or used? What will happen to that waste? And so ultimately, I think the potential here is very strong that we'll have much more understanding of where our materials are sourced, how the systems operate, how the performs, and also it will tell us much more how we can improve these performances. And ultimately, it's like if you were to draw a parallel, it's a bit like going to a farm to table where you know exactly where your lettuce is sourced, where it's grown, what was the impact on the territory where it was. Similarly, we'll have an understanding of these kind of construction materials, what their impact is on biodiversity, habitat loss, water management, and ultimately, we're going to go way beyond just carbon emissions and additional carbons. We're actually going to be seeing much more of these metrics becoming integrated in our design process.
Fascinating perspective. The things that keeps me busy, team busy, is I actually did as an architect myself, later in my career on the construction management of the table. So I was on the receiving end of design drawings, and I realized that building information, meaning like inaccurate background drawings, were at the core of some of my jobs first as a designer and then as a construction manager. And in our particular case, we realized is that by combining 3D scanning and 3D modeling, we're able to kind of accurately just verify faster, right? So very much kind of scan to BIM. And fast forward to today, 6 years later, where we are digitizing something upwards of about 6 buildings a day, from like homes to skyscrapers, hospitals to schools. But I think very much what you just said is exactly what I think my team and I have kind of had the opportunity to see in the front lines, where as a result of this process happening at scale and with a certain level of standard and detail, we're now able to kind of understand the parts, pieces, and components of a building, the kind of the necessary accounting that you mentioned, where quantifying existing doors, windows, floor areas, everything instantly, in order to be able to then proactively then determine what should be, is really powerful, especially when in the hands of owner operators, right? That, for example, have an existing asset. There's some sort of repositioning or renovation that needs to happen, and the first question that they need to be able to answer, or at least for their stakeholders, architects, engineers, contractors, is what exactly exists first. I get really excited to see, I'm approaching it more from the kind of the what is side. And then, you as an architect approaching it is like, okay, well, here's now what should be, right? And so I get really excited to see that kind of relaying of the baton, right, from one phase to the other, but having that kind of data-centric data approach there. So really excited about it.
And what's interesting, one of the challenges with that is there's currently quite a big lack of standards there and standards of definition. So ideally, we would love to see a centralized way of understanding what is there, you could ultimately, if you have a pool of all the existing underused buildings in New York City, you could actually start to, connect the dots and see which ones are making most sense to redevelop, which ones are, also in terms of construction waste, you could see which buildings have what kind of waste and how you could potentially reappropriate those or reuse those materials. Yeah. Ultimately, the digitization there is really the key into making this process much more streamlined.
And I guess with that, it's a great place to end it. I'm excited to follow your work, and it's been incredible. I mean, you touched on so many aspects, from your own upbringing to the way you view data and the way you use it and the way that influences design. I can imagine in part two, we have the opportunity to dive in even deeper. But for folks that might want to follow your work, how do they follow you? Did you LinkedIn or website or something?
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. You can check out the team's work at kpf.com, or you can find me on my Instagram, where I post mostly things that inspire me or things that I encounter on my travels, or use my LinkedIn account to stay in touch.
Nice. Rutger, thanks so much for joining, and I'm excited to do a part two.
Thanks for having me.